Hello again, and welcome to the Do-It-Yourself Workshop. The workshop was asked to come in and assess the damage and make repairs to a ceiling and a wall from a leaking roof that has gone unchecked for a number of years. One of the most commonly used products in today's building industry is drywall. Drywall was invented in 1916 as a building fire retardant, and it was marketed as the poor man's answer to plaster. Anyone that has done any home remodeling or works in the home remodeling or building field know the benefits of drywall. Plaster, on the other hand, is still being used today, but its cost is highly prohibitive. Plaster requires special building techniques and a highly skilled craftsman to apply the material. This photo clearly demonstrates the special building techniques required before plaster can even begin to be laid. Once the building is built and each room is framed according to specifications, the next step begins. As seen here, thin strips of wood called lath boards are nailed to the framing members throughout the house, which form the rooms, the walls, the ceilings, the hallways, the stairwells. All the framing members must be covered with lath boards. When fresh plaster, wet plaster is applied, it's forced onto these lath boards and forced through the openings, the joints, in the lath boards. After the first coat of plaster is dried, the material that was forced through the joints in the lath boards now act as a holding agent. So the plaster actually wraps around the lath boards, forming a tight bond between itself and the stable wood. We are going to make repairs to the ceiling and the walls with a plaster-like substance. Comes in a bag, it's a dry powder, you mix it with water. I'd like you to take notice of the wall. Directly below the hole in the ceiling, you see the cracks in the wall. The plaster has been water damaged. Water's gotten behind the plaster. Here's a nice drawing. I've penciled in some lines to demonstrate the water. Here's a close-up of the plaster that's actually cracked. Here we can begin to make repairs. All this loose material on the ceiling and the wall has to be removed. It has to be squared off, scraped down to the bare lath boards. So let's begin. Another member of the Do-It-Yourself Workshop has volunteered to help out. Here we're going to start out by laying a tarp. We want to contain most of the material that we're going to scrape off. First, we want to square off the area where the ceiling hole is, moving further enough from the hole so as to take up all the loose material that we do not see. Using a utility knife, we will score the plaster on the pencil lines we drew earlier. Scoring the plaster, this will give us a nice, clean, even break as we remove chunks of loose plaster. Next, using a claw hammer, but very, very gently, we will break off loose chunks of plaster, trying carefully not to go beyond the score lines. Obviously, our drop cloth saved a lot of cleaning. And we end up with a nice clean cut opening where all the loose material has been removed. Due to the thickness of this particular plastered ceiling, we are going to use a filler board to take up some of the space. A large number of holes must be drilled in the filler board, so when the wet plaster is applied, it will be forced into these holes, very similar to using lath boards. And as an extra measure, a plaster screen mesh will be applied on top of the wood. This surface is now ready to receive its first coat of plaster. My helper has been busy mixing the powdered material in a 5-gallon bucket. Plastering requires a number of applications. It can't generally be done in one coat. After the application of possibly 2 coats, you should be within the reasonable thickness to match the area you're plastering around. You will now have to sand each coat until evenness is achieved. Here you see the results after the first application. The reason I say a number of coats is because you cannot gob this material on. Most of these repair materials are water-based, and as the water evaporates, the same as cement, the water will evaporate. This material, if it's applied too thickly, it will shrink, and shrinks will create cracks, and this is what we do not want. The repair material I am using here is advertised as non-shrinking. I could put it on a little thicker, but I still want to make several applications. A material like joint compound cannot be applied in a thick layer. It definitely will crack. I have already removed the loose material from the wall. Luckily, the water damage did not penetrate the entire thickness of the plaster on the wall. Only the surface material was removed. Some areas were dug out a little deeper than other areas. We now must drill numerous holes in the area to be repaired. The holes will act as the anchors for the new material which we will apply. Fresh plaster, wet plaster, is being applied. You can see that it's being forced into the drill holes. And remember, the first few coats of material, the first few applications do not have to be perfect. They do not have to look perfect. Here's our wall after the first application of new plaster. The first application was allowed to dry 48 hours. We're now back to apply the second coat. I will now switch to my widest trowel to smooth this entire area. The second coat on the ceiling is now being applied. You can see the smaller 6-inch tool is being used to make the application. Because the ceiling sustained major damage, more material, more coats must be applied to the ceiling as compared to the wall. Apply the new material liberally but lightly. Fill all joints. Force the material into cracks, into crevices. Try to achieve consistent uniformity where you have very few valleys and very few ridges. Our second application of plaster is now complete. We must stop and allow the material to dry for another 48 hours. The second application of plaster was sanded earlier. Plaster mesh tape was applied at the joint between the new and old plaster, and a third light coat was applied. This is where we're at now. I'm sanding this coat. After the third coat was applied and sanded, a fourth skim coat is now being applied. Notice this coat is being applied well beyond the boundary between old and new. In order to achieve a relative evenness between the transition of old and new, plaster must be applied beyond the joint and just thick enough to cover the joint tape. When sanding plaster, the loose dust is so light that it floats on the room air current. So it is highly recommended to use a water filtration system where the dust is collected in the sanding block, transported through the tubing into a bucket containing water, operated by a shop tap. After the ceiling and the wall has been successfully repaired and enough time allowed for each to dry thoroughly, a plaster sealer must now be applied. So here you have it. We went from this to this, the finished product, after numerous coats, light coats of fresh plaster. The plaster sealer will now dry. It'll dry white and almost match the color of the walls. So we may not even have to paint the walls.